In this episode, we examine the worst zoo attacks ever recorded on camera. 5 cases where routine operations inside animal enclosures suddenly failed, from a groundskeeper caught in a confinement breach to a delivery driver dragged through a feeding hatch in seconds. We begin with the first incident, where a familiar stunt crossed an invisible boundary and triggered a feeding response, captured frame by frame on camera. It was June 12, 2017, and the humid air above a regional wildlife park in northern Thailand hung heavy with anticipation as dozens of visitors crowded the railings, phones raised and recording. Below them, movement rippled through a concrete-lined enclosure, their prehistoric forms cutting through the murky water with predatory precision that millions of years of evolution had perfected. Precha Somchai had been performing his rope balancing act above dangerous animals for nearly 15 years, earning a modest living as a freelance entertainer hired by regional zoos, seeking spectacle without the expense of international performers. At 39, the wiry performer had built a reputation for reliability rather than fame, consistently delivering his signature routine of crossing a thin rope suspended roughly 18 feet above crocodile enclosures while the animals fed below. His performances drew steady crowds who came to witness the carefully calculated risk that had made him a familiar presence at wildlife parks across northern Thailand. Precha's motivation for continuing such dangerous work came from both financial necessity and professional pride. His wife had been managing diabetes for several years, and the cost of medication consumed most of their income. The zoo circuit paid better than factory or farm labor available to someone with limited formal education. He had completed the same routine more than 180 times without serious injury, though several close calls in recent months had begun to unsettle him. A recent medical checkup had revealed early degenerative changes in his knees and ankles, reinforcing his awareness that his career depended on borrowed time. Saltwater crocodiles are apex predators, capable of explosive acceleration over short distances, particularly in shallow water, with adult males commonly reaching 14 to 17 feet in managed captive environments and bite forces exceeding 3,000 pounds per square inch. The Chiang Mai Zoo's breeding population had entered its annual mating season, a period associated with increased surface movement, tolerance overlap, and heightened responsiveness to vibration rather than true territorial defense. Keepers had documented frequent lunging toward feeding stimuli and splashing, especially when multiple males were present. That morning, maintenance staff replaced one of the rope's anchor points after discovering dangerous fraying in the hemp fibers, but time constraints forced them to skip Precha's usual pre-show rehearsal. The viewing deck was packed beyond normal capacity with more than 60 spectators, many holding smartphones to record the performance. Zoo management had recently installed a new overhead security camera system covering the enclosure from multiple angles, equipment that would later provide investigators with precise time-stamped footage. Senior keeper Narong Wijit attempted to brief Precha about the crocodile's heightened activity, but the performer dismissed the warning as routine. Precha had noticed increased surface movement during recent shows, but attributed it to feeding anticipation rather than elevated risk. The replacement rope felt noticeably more elastic under his feet during initial testing, but his confidence in long-practiced balance techniques led him to ignore the difference. Precha began his crossing as keepers initiated feeding below, tossing raw poultry into the enclosure to draw the crocodiles away from the rope overhead. Halfway across the 38-foot span, humidity and his approximately 140-pound body weight caused the new rope to stretch further than expected, sagging several inches. His left foot slipped on the damp fibers, forcing a sudden weight shift he could not recover from. Precha dropped roughly 16 feet, clipping a timber support beam on the way down before slamming onto a wet concrete ledge at the enclosure's edge, the impact shattering his left tibia and collapsing his leg beneath him. He was immediately immobilized and unable to retreat as the crocodiles surged toward the disturbance. This frantic kinetic energy provided the exact stimulus required to trigger a predatory strike. The first crocodile seized Precha's lower leg, crushing the limb and shattering both lower leg bones. A second animal clamped onto his torso at the hip and abdomen, initiating a forceful rolling maneuver typical of prey subjugation rather than territorial defense. The rotation twisted his body violently, producing lumbar spine fractures and extensive internal organ rupture. As keepers struck the water with poles, a third crocodile latched onto his right arm, pulling in the opposite direction and causing traumatic avulsion at the elbow joint. The overhead camera recorded 87 seconds from impact to full submersion. Precha's movements weakened rapidly as catastrophic blood loss, crush trauma, and hypovolemic shock set in. The crocodiles maintained feeding grips until the largest male dragged the body into deeper water. Emergency services were called immediately, but the zoo's response team reached the enclosure edge just under 2 minutes later, unable to intervene safely. The coroner documented injuries consistent with crocodilian feeding behavior: multiple long bone fractures, traumatic amputation, spinal fractures, massive soft tissue destruction, and fatal exsanguination. All live animal performances were suspended quietly. The crocodiles were not euthanized after investigators confirmed a human enclosure breach. The recording was sealed, the performances quietly ended, and the loss reduced to archived footage. But danger doesn't require a crowd. In the American Midwest, a restricted service corridor would become the site of another attack, caught just as clearly on camera. It was August 3, 2013, and a large regional wildlife park in the American Midwest was already straining under a brutal summer heat wave. By mid-morning, temperatures had climbed to 97 degrees, and the narrow service corridors behind public exhibits echoed with the constant whir of maintenance equipment as crews raced to keep pathways clear. Staff rotations were shortened, supervisors were stretched thin, and small procedural shortcuts began to accumulate. Unnoticed conditions that would quietly turn an ordinary workday into a sudden, violent emergency caught on camera. Darnell Price had been working as a summer groundskeeper for exactly 28 days, hired through a temporary employment agency to help maintain the zoo's landscaping during peak visitor season. At 27, he was saving money for community college while living with his grandmother, taking pride in showing up early and finishing every task despite low wages and physically demanding condition. That morning, his supervisor assigned him to clear accumulated leaves and debris from service corridors behind the primate exhibits, work that rarely involved animals directly, but paid overtime due to an ongoing heat advisory. Darnell's unfamiliarity with zoo safety procedures stemmed from abbreviated orientation training, shortened due to summer staffing shortage. He had been briefed on visitor area safety, but had not received instruction on service corridor containment systems or emergency animal response protocols. As a temporary worker, he was excluded from internal staff bulletins, including a warning memo circulated 3 days earlier that documented barrier testing behavior by an adult male chimpanzee during extreme heat. The memo identified Caesar, a fully mature male weighing an estimated 130 to 150 pounds, who had been observed repeatedly manipulating door latches and probing unsecured access points with deliberate, tool-like precision. Adult chimpanzees are not dramatically stronger than humans pound for pound, but they possess exceptional upper body pulling strength, dense fast-twitch muscle fibers, and an extremely powerful grip capable of maintaining control even during resistance. Their bite force is sufficient to produce deep puncture wounds, crush injuries, and avulsions, and during aggressive encounters, they instinctively target the face, hands, and feet, patterns consistently documented in both wild and captive attacks. Chimpanzee violence is not predatory, but an explosive dominance and threat elimination response that can continue in short bursts once initiated, especially when the perceived threat moves, vocalizes, or attempts to flee. The service corridor behind the chimpanzee enclosure included redundant containment doors, but maintenance delays had left one electronic lock unreliable following recent power fluctuations. Earlier that morning, cleaning staff temporarily bypassed the malfunctioning lock, leaving a secondary door unsecured, a protocol violation that went undocumented due to reduced supervision. Fixed CCTV cameras monitored the corridor for liability, equipment that would later capture the entire incident. After roughly 90 minutes of work, Darnell noticed elevated chimp vocalizations, but dismissed them as routine. The noise from his leaf blower masked the subtle metallic clicks of Caesar manipulating the unsecured latch, a task well within the chimp's demonstrated problem-solving ability. Public visitors and most staff remained unaware, as the service corridor was isolated from the main walkways. Caesar emerged silently into the corridor while Darnell's back was turned. The juvenile moved quickly and low to the ground. When Darnell turned and saw the chimp, he froze briefly before running, a movement that triggered a chase and attack response rather than predation. The initial tackle drove Darnell hard onto the concrete, his head striking the floor with enough force to snap it sideways, forcing the air from his lungs. Caesar immediately mounted his upper body, using forelimb grip and body weight to pin him. The first bite tore into the left cheek, avulsing soft tissue and opening the buccal cavity, causing rapid arterial bleeding. Subsequent bites targeted the mouth and left eye, consistent with documented chimpanzee attack patterns. As Caesar dragged and repositioned him, Darnell's face struck the concrete repeatedly, and canines penetrated the upper lip and orbit, with facial fractures resulting from the combined bite trauma and blunt head impacts, rupturing the globe and producing immediate vision loss and severe hemorrhage. As Darnell raised his hands defensively, Caesar redirected to the fingers, crushing and partially amputating the index and middle fingertips through bite force combined with twisting, a common chimpanzee subjugation behavior. CCTV footage shows Caesar utilizing his superior grip strength to latch onto Darnell's belt and lower leg, initiating a series of violent, explosive jerks rather than a sustained drag. The juvenile was able to move Darnell's 140-pound frame in short, 4-foot bursts, slamming Darnell's head against the concrete with each repositioning maneuver. Caesar utilized the high-friction surface of his own soles to gain leverage, effectively rowing the larger man's body across the corridor floor. Staff hesitated for approximately 30 seconds, uncertain whether the sounds indicated an emergency or routine maintenance. The corridor's isolation muffled screams, delaying recognition. A veteran zookeeper activated the internal alarm roughly 40 seconds after first contact, identifying the vocalizations as distress calls. The emergency team arrived about 3 minutes after the breach, advancing with shields. Caesar disengaged and retreated when confronted by multiple staff. Darnell was found unresponsive but with a palpable pulse, suffering profuse facial hemorrhage. On-site responders applied pressure dressings and airway support before transport. At the hospital, imaging revealed extensive facial fractures, orbital destruction, multiple rib fractures, and a concussion, along with severe blood loss leading to hypovolemic shock. Despite rapid transfusion and surgical intervention, secondary complications developed, including airway edema, aspiration of blood, and worsening intracranial swelling. Darnell suffered cardiorespiratory collapse several hours after admission and could not be resuscitated. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as complications of blunt force trauma and massive facial injuries with hemorrhagic shock following a chimpanzee attack. Caesar was sedated and returned to his enclosure after investigators confirmed human containment failure rather than abnormal animal aggression. The zoo received penalties and revised training and lock maintenance protocol. News coverage remained local and brief, with no public release of the footage. Investigators blamed containment failure, not the animal, and the exhibit reopened after penalties were issued. In southern Africa, however, a routine delivery would leave no room for survival when a feeding barrier failed. It was April 21, 2018, and the concrete service corridors beneath a major wildlife facility in Johannesburg, South Africa, echoed with the mechanical rhythms of a routine feeding operation. Below the public walkways, a delivery system built to keep humans and enclosures strictly separated was already failing in subtle ways. Within minutes, a single mechanical fault would turn an ordinary work assignment into a lethal encounter driven entirely by instinct, speed, and force. Sifo Dlamini had been delivering meat to zoological facilities across Gauteng province for 8 months, working as an independent contractor for a livestock supplier that serviced several animal parks in the region. At 41, the former cattle farmhand was experienced with heavy carcasses and accustomed to the smells and hazards of raw meat handling. His understanding of animal behavior was limited to domestic livestock, and his exposure to wild predators had been restricted to brief encounters with jackals and caracals on rural properties. His reputation for punctuality made him the preferred substitute when regular drivers were unavailable. That morning, Sifo was called in to replace the zoo's regular meat delivery driver, who had been hospitalized overnight with severe food poisoning. His instructions were simple: deliver approximately 180 pounds of horse meat to the lion feeding station and operate the mechanical hatch system designed to allow food transfer without direct physical access to the enclosure. The pay was double his usual rate, money Sifo urgently needed to cover his daughter's upcoming university registration fees. African lions are apex predators capable of exerting bite forces estimated between 650 and 750 pounds per square inch, with explosive muscular power developed for ambush and prey restraint rather than prolonged chewing. Adult males in captivity can weigh over 400 pounds and retain strong prey drive responses during feeding, especially when conditioned to associate overhead movement with food delivery. The feeding hatch had been repaired 3 days earlier after a mechanical jam. Replacement components reduced tolerance margins, requiring slower alignment and a 2-step release procedure. The updated handling guidance had not been distributed, leaving Sifo unaware that manual force could worsen a partial jam. Headkeeper Marcus Venter and his assistant were occupied escorting a school group nearby, leaving the feeding bay unsupervised, despite internal policy requiring keeper presence. Sifo loaded the meat into the transfer chamber and initiated the hatch sequence. The mechanism stalled with the opening roughly 16 inches wide, too narrow for containers to pass but wide enough to expose the interior. He attempts to reset the controls. When the system failed to respond, Sifo reached forward, trying to push the hatch downward by hand. Below, the adult male lion had been pacing for several minutes, fixated on scent and vibration rather than visual detail, a pattern noted repeatedly in prior incident logs. documenting feeding area aggression. When Sifo reached into the gap to clear the jam, the lion launched upward and hooked its claws into the heavy fabric of his jacket. This allowed the lion to pull Sifo's arm tight against the steel frame of the hatch, pinning it in place. With the arm anchored, the lion was able to get a secure, crushing grip with its jaws just above the wrist. The bite fractured both the radius and ulna through compressive force, while the lion's canines penetrated muscle and lacerated the radial artery, causing immediate, high-volume bleeding. Sifo screamed as the lion initiated a prey pull response, bracing his forelimbs and dragging backward. The hatch edge sheared skin and muscle as tension increased, compounding tissue loss. The lion maintained the bite while applying short, forceful head pulls rather than a full killing bite, behavior consistent with restraining large prey. Sifo continued to struggle, twisting and attempting to brace against the hatch as his shoulder dislocated under sustained traction and ligaments tore under load. Blood loss increased steadily, spreading across the concrete inside the enclosure. Sifo's strength diminished over the next minute, his movements becoming slower and less coordinated as progressive hypovolemic shock developed. The sounds, metal scraping, tearing tissue, and sustained screams, were audible in the adjacent exhibit. Children heard the noise but were moved away before seeing anything. Sifo's colleagues responded approximately 20 seconds after the initial bite, triggering the emergency barrier and high-pressure water deterrent. The lion released his grip as the system activated. Veterinary staff reached the bay moments later. Paramedics arrived roughly 4 minutes after the attack began, finding Sifo unconscious. Medical assessment documented open forearm fractures, complete radial artery transection, extensive soft tissue avulsion, shoulder dislocation, and crush injury to the hand, necessitating immediate wrist-level amputation. Sifo died during emergency surgery from massive blood loss and irreversible shock. The lion was euthanized the following day after review confirmed prior unreported feeding area aggression. The zoo settled privately with Sifo's family and revised protocols to require multiple trained staff present during all predator feedings. The footage never surfaced. The settlement stayed private, and the enclosure was modified after the fact. In Japan, no machinery failed at all, only balance, sending a visitor past a railing and into a space meant to stay unreachable. It was October 14, 2015, and the autumn quiet of a major wildlife park in Tokyo, Japan, settled over exhibits undergoing seasonal maintenance. Temporary barriers and renovation equipment narrowed walkways and partially obscured long-standing safety notices. Midweek attendance had thinned to a handful of elderly locals and foreign tourists, creating a subdued, almost empty atmosphere, one that would prove deadly when a sudden medical episode unfolded amid the shadows of ongoing improvements. Naoko Ishida had worked as an office administrator for a Tokyo insurance firm for more than 2 decades, maintaining near-perfect attendance until recent episodes of vertigo forced her to take medical leave for the first time in her career. At 52, she had been diagnosed with an inner ear balance disorder, and her physician advised light walking and low-stress activity to evaluate whether her symptoms were stabilizing. On a quiet weekday afternoon, she chose to visit Ueno Zoo, a familiar place with paved paths where she believed she could move slowly, stop when needed, and avoid crowds. The visit marked her first solo outing since the diagnosis 3 weeks earlier. It was meant to be a controlled test of independence rather than recreation. Naoko planned to walk a few exhibits at a time, rest frequently, and leave early if dizziness returned. The zoo, which she had visited many times in childhood, felt predictable and safe, an environment where she could focus on balance without pressure or urgency. Asiatic black bears are medium-sized but extremely powerful omnivores, typically weighing between 200 and 440 pounds. Unlike large brown bears, they are not inclined to hunt humans, and almost all serious attacks occur in defensive contexts, when a bear is startled, cornered, or perceives an intruder inside its territory. Their strength lies in explosive bursts of speed, heavy forelimbs used for striking, and jaws capable of inflicting crushing injuries during short, violent encounters, rather than prolonged feeding. At the time, the bear exhibit was undergoing renovation. Drainage work in the moat and temporary fencing along the visitor railing had altered sightlines and narrowed standing space. Construction signage and barriers partially obscured standard warnings about leaning over railings. Security cameras remained operational, but staffing levels were reduced, and live monitoring was inconsistent during weekday afternoons. Naoko stopped near the bear enclosure to take photos with her phone. As she leaned forward, a familiar wave of vertigo began, usually brief if she remained still. To see past the construction fencing, she leaned farther over the permanent railing than intended. When the dizziness intensified instead of easing, her weight shifted forward. The altered barrier layout offered no secondary support, and her grip failed as she lost consciousness. She fell approximately 18 feet into the dry concrete moat, The impact fractured her left hip and pelvis and left her severely disoriented, unable to stand or orient herself. The noise and vibration drew the attention of a 280-pound adult male Asiatic black bear, which emerged from its shelter to investigate the disturbance inside its enclosure. The bear's response was defensive. It charged the length of the moat in seconds and struck first with a forelimb, knocking Naoko sideways across the concrete. As she attempted to crawl, the movement reinforced the bear's perception of an active threat. It delivered short, forceful bites to her arms and legs, then struck with its paws, behavior consistent with territorial defense rather than predation. The bites caused deep soft tissue injuries and fractures from blunt force and crushing pressure rather than tearing or feeding behavior. The encounter unfolded over roughly 2 to 3 minutes. Security footage later showed the bear breaking contact multiple times, backing away briefly before re-engaging only when Naoko moved or cried out. A tourist on the upper walkway captured audio of screams while searching for staff, though the moat itself was largely obscured by construction barrier. A nearby visitor alerted a security guard within about 30 seconds, but communication delays slowed response. Emergency staff reached the enclosure approximately 5 minutes after the fall and sedated the bear before paramedics entered the moat. Naoko was found unconscious with multiple fractures, severe blood loss, and head trauma consistent with the fall and subsequent assault. She died during emergency surgery from complications related to hemorrhage and traumatic brain injury. Veterinary review confirmed the bear's behavior was defensive and species typical, and it was returned to the exhibit. The zoo later installed anti-lean barriers along elevated walkways and adjusted renovation protocols. The bear was cleared and returned to its enclosure, and the incident was labeled a tragic accident. But behind locked doors in Southeast Asia, a feeding task would unfold exactly as instinct dictated, with no chance for recovery. It was September 3, 2014, and the humid service corridors of a regional wildlife park in southern Vietnam pulsed with the low mechanical hum of climate control units straining against the heat. In Ho Chi Minh City, weeks of understaffing and deferred safety checks had quietly compounded, turning routine husbandry into latent risk. With temperatures near 89 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity above 85%, physiological stress was already elevated among staff and animals alike. By mid-morning, a standard feeding task, captured in full by internal security cameras, would unravel into a fatal incident. Minh Tran, 32, had worked as a junior reptile caretaker at the facility for just under 18 months. His duties focused on enclosure cleaning, waste removal, and food preparation, not direct handling of dangerous animals. Minh was known as punctual and cooperative, the kind of employee who filled gaps when schedules collapsed. Chronic staff shortages had steadily expanded his responsibilities beyond his training. Recent budget cuts reduced the reptile unit from 8 keepers to 5. Senior staff were diverted to public demonstrations for visiting school groups, leaving Minh assigned to a feeding task typically performed by 2 certified handlers. He was not authorized to feed large constrictors alone, but over time, pay and implicit pressure made refusal unlikely. His confidence came from observation rather than instruction, watching experienced keepers repeat the same procedure without incident. Reticulated pythons are the longest snakes on record, with verified individuals exceeding 25 feet and 300 pounds. Their primary killing mechanism is circulatory arrest, rapid strikes followed by constriction that compresses major blood vessels, leading to loss of consciousness in only a few seconds. They strike toward movement and heat, particularly during feeding, when arousal thresholds are lowest. The park's adult female reticulated python measured approximately 19 feet and weighed an estimated 220 pounds. She had refused food for nearly 3 weeks, a common precursor to an explosive feeding response once prey is reintroduced. Keeper logs noted increased alert posture and repeated contact with enclosure barriers. Policy required 2 handlers for feeding, but Minh was instructed to proceed alone to keep the schedule intact. He prepared the meal, a roughly 15-pound pig carcass, and approached the sliding steel feeding hatch designed to limit exposure. Hallway cameras show him opening the hatch and leaning forward, positioning the carcass inside. His stance suggested familiarity, not caution. The strike occurred in under half a second. The python surged upward and locked onto Minh's hand and forearm as he reached into the hatch. Its recurved teeth functioned as anchors, preventing withdrawal. As Minh reflexively pulled back, the tension allowed the snake to whip its head across his body and throw the first coil high around his neck, initiating constriction immediately. In a single fluid motion, the python wrapped multiple coils around Minh's neck and upper chest, bracing against the steel frame for leverage. Constriction tightened instantly with his first exhalation. Bilateral carotid compression caused abrupt cerebral hypoxia, and Minh's attempted shout collapsed into 2 short, panicked gasps before muscle tone failed. Security footage shows loss of posture within seconds rather than prolonged struggle, consistent with rapid circulatory occlusion rather than airway obstruction. Min went limp almost immediately as consciousness shut down. The coils continued tightening after collapse, an instinctive response that does not stop once prey is neutralized. The snake maintained the wrap for several minutes to ensure death before release. There was no crushing of the chest cavity. Sustained vascular compression and positional restraint alone prevented recovery. Min never regained consciousness. Senior Keeper heard the impact of the fall and radioed security about 1 minute after the strike, but confusion delayed escalation. The emergency team arrived approximately 3 minutes after the onset, using pressurized water and metal tools to force disengagement. The medical examiner ruled the death hypoxic ischemic brain injury due to prolonged carotid compression with associated cervical soft tissue trauma. No spinal fracture was identified, consistent with large constrictor fatalities. The python was sedated and transferred to an off-site holding and research enclosure. Local coverage amounted to a brief workplace accident notice. The footage was never released. Thanks for watching. If you liked these stories, click here.